Lane shift ahead. We're looking at a little departure from the straight and narrow on today's episode of the Business of Biotech. I'm your host, Matt Pillar, and today we're turning to a leader from the big pharma scene for some conversation on how to attract and retain advanced therapy, development, manufacturing, and clinical talent. It's an important discussion in an industry where that talent is in short supply and the competition for it is relentless. Michael Mehler is an uber-focused expert in cell therapy, clinical, and regulatory matters. His experience dates back to his days as research study associate at Stanford and clinical research manager at Penn, and he's further honed those skills in senior roles at Adaptimmune and GSK, where he currently serves as senior clinical development manager, working specifically on cell therapy oncology. In the roles he's played on the front lines and in the trenches of cellular therapeutic development, from clinical activity to approval and beyond, Michael has seen and felt the strain of a fast-paced industry that's severely short on the skilled talent necessary to sustain its potential. So today, my friend and colleague, Erin Harris, chief editor at cellandgene.com, is once again joining me for a conversation with Michael, who also happens to be an active member of Erin's editorial board. Erin, welcome back. And Michael, I'm thrilled you could join us.
Thanks for having me back, Matt.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, well, we're excited to have you. And I want to start by sort of getting some perspective, Michael, on your career. So your career, I guess, as it relates to this fast-moving space in cell and gene, specifically cell therapy. So you've been in the game for what, about 15 years?
I would say, about 15 years now. Yeah,
going on 15 years maybe. So regardless, that's, the 15-year time frame, that's early days for cell and gene, for sure.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious from a talent perspective, if you could kind of tell us when you first started your career in the space, what were the challenges facing professionals like you getting involved in cell therapy, and what do those challenges look like today? Do they still exist? Are they, maybe not as acute?
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's interesting to hear you mention Stanford too, because if you kind of go all the way back, I'm actually a perfect example of someone who is not necessarily, a bench lab scientist or a wet lab scientist, but who truly at my foundation has an incredibly high curiosity for certain types of research. So back at Stanford, and this was in postgraduate school, I volunteered there in their research department working on some genetic research they were doing in the psychophysiology department. So, my master's degree is in experimental research, so learning how to do clean research, so to speak. And at Stanford, some of the folks that we worked with, they're actually some of the folks who ended up co-founding 23andMe. So that was my first insight into genetic research. After that, I came back to Pennsylvania and was offered, a position at University of Pennsylvania where we were executing a lot of phase 1 clinical trials. Certainly interesting and exciting. And that was my first step into clinical research. But it wasn't until my experience at Adaptimmune as a clinical scientist and a very young biotech company with just a handful of people here in the clinical operations group in the States that I was exposed to the cell and gene therapy side. So I wouldn't say the challenge getting into it was incredible, but there's no doubt I was drawn to the company and asked to join them based on my really just overwhelming response to how groundbreaking the research that they were doing was, and to be able to actually help people. So I think that's important to note that in this space, right, it's fast, it's challenging, you need to be incredibly innovative, but at your core, you have to have that curiosity. And quite frankly, to think that this research is just really cool, because it is. If you look around at what we do, I'm grateful every day to actually be in this space where we are helping people. But also, if you think about what we're doing, using your own T cells to harness an immune response to fight cancer, that one of the leading causes of death in the world. I mean, it is truly incredible. So I think that's important to sort of have that foundation of curiosity, drive, and innovation in this type of space, even for non-bench lab scientists like myself.
Yeah.
So those challenges, specifically, again, getting in, I don't think it exists as much so long as you can find the right talent.
Yeah, and that it's interesting. You should point to that curiosity. The point you make about curiosity. I recently had a call with some folks over at Project Pharma that we turned into a roundtable we published on Bioprocess Online, and it was on this very topic. Addressing the talent crunch in cell and gene manufacturing, and they talked about that. They talked about even today. It's sort of a two-pronged exercise. One of them being what institutions are helping to prepare cell and gene knowledge and talent, but also that curiosity being a key kind of prong on the spear, because it's got to come from within. Like when you went to Adaptimmune, what was that, 5 years ago ish?
This was back in 2013.
More than 5 years ago. But yeah, in 2013, when you joined Adaptimmune and became exposed to the cell and gene work that they were doing, it was like, you didn't necessarily come from a rigorous cell and gene clinical trials training background. You had to have that curiosity and develop the expertise from within, along with your colleagues, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's nice now, when we were doing this at Adaptimmune with such a small group, right? There was a Kite, there was Juno, but there were no SOPs for product development. And we saw things occurring at clinical sites that, I can say for sure are not occurring now, whether it's what do nurses, how do they thaw products? How do they inspect products? What happens when these cells come back to a hospital? And back in 2013, it was not occurring as much as it is now. I mean, there's hundreds of these companies. The nurses are now the cell therapy staff, they're now overwhelmed at the hospitals with so many. But you talk about almost 10 years ago, and we saw patients being maybe at-risk lymphodepleted prior to the product would arrive on site, where we would say it will get there, and maybe there were human error or hiccups that occurred before the patient could get infused, while the product was en route. And those types of errors or learnings, I mean, they were incredibly impactful for patient safety, for company, for developing these SOPs that now exist for whether it's an emerging biotech or global pharma. But back in 2013, there were very few of these processes and procedures that existed in this space. So those challenges, they don't exist as much today, but they certainly were very evident back in 2013, which I'm still grateful to have been, a part of that. But there were some challenging learnings for sure in a young, small biotech where this had not been done nearly as prevalent as it is today.
Yeah, sure. And Michael, I think, so one of the things that I know I've talked to your peers on our editorial advisory board about this very thing of how much the sector has evolved in terms of the need for skilled talent, but how skilled talent they've attracted and they've retained them, and how, as a result of how far the sector has come, but the need is still very great. And so how do we go about that? How do we find them? How do we retain them? And so what's your perspective on that? Where do you think the greatest need today, maybe even versus your days back at Adaptimmune, is for skilled talent? And it's probably across the board, if I would imagine, but what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think for sure with the amount of, new agents that are coming up, I mean, we know in 2025 that there will be hundreds of INDs that the FDA are reviewing for these types of therapies. So automatically, right off the bat, the manufacturing, whether it's allogeneic or autologous or vaccine development, you're going to need to have skilled manufacturing teams. And these folks, the training that occurs for them, that's certainly a need right now. There's no question about that. But that said, there's also in clinical development, because of how complex these products are and delivering them to patients, clinical development also has a strong need for folks that can sit cross-functionally and that can speak to each element that occurs from a vein-to-vein or even an allogeneic off-the-shelf product. So I think both manufacturing and clinical development need skilled experts in this space that are able to have a really strong understanding of what occurs from a vein-to-vein experience for patients. I think you could also. I think finding the talent for that is certainly challenging, but in a manufacturing standpoint, I think training could occur earlier. There are certainly postgraduate degrees, in biotech and certain manufacturing areas. So I'm not so sure exactly how you can find these people or get the training up to speed, but I know that there's certainly a gap there.
Okay. And even if we bring them on earlier, from a training perspective, or even from, once they've begun with their teams, what sort of perhaps, ongoing education or experience can they learn on site? Like if you had to talk to, since we're talking to small and emerging biotechs,
Sure.
What is your advice for the people who are already on the team to keep in terms of ongoing training? What do you think could help them meet their needs?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to remember is we learn the most from the clinical sites that are performing these, that are administering these therapies. I think whether it's a young emerging biotech or a global pharmaceutical company, the first thing to remember is that the people at the hospital, and of course the patients first, they are the ones that have the most insights into what's working and what's not working. So we have found that having consultancies or working closely with our sites to understand what's working, what's not working, what we can do better, what's making the patients' lives more challenging because of this therapy. That's something that we have found that we bring that information back and then we implement additional training at the company. So I think that's the first thing to keep in mind, is that it's really the people who are actually administering these therapies in the hospitals that have the most insight into what's working. Even for commercialized product, we hear, this went really well and this did not go very well. And the younger companies that are coming up need to get that information so that they're not just repeating the same mistakes that happen. And we hear firsthand from clinical sites that tell us, look, this really did not go well. Let us help you so that when you commercialize this and bring this to market, that it can be smoother than the first few go-rounds that we've had with other products. So I think when you get that information from what has worked and what has not worked, that's how you can implement where the training is needed and how the training can be applied to folks at your company, whether it's a young company or a large company.
Michael, when you talk about that feedback loop that you just referenced at the clinical site in the hospital, is that, I just want to make sure that I'm clear on this, is that feedback coming from hospital staff, or is it coming from GSK employees, or Adaptimmune, whatever, the company employees kind of on the ground?
Yeah, these are from directly from hospital staff and directly from hospitals that have administered cell therapy products.
Yeah, that's an incredible.
Yeah, it really is. And that to me is something that I don't think we forget, but it's something to keep in mind. I know for sure, and I'm guilty of it too, thinking that we have all the answers and that we know, and we approach clinical sites and we say, this is what you need to do. And in return, sometimes the clinical sites say, that's not actually what we need to do. We can't have 7 collections, or we can't administer this during these days. We can't collect cells during these days, or we can't ask a patient to stay, even for commercialized products, for 30 days within this. So there's so much feedback that is incredibly valuable that we hear from the clinical sites. And I think for as fast, and as developed as this space is becoming, I think we have to sort of step back occasionally and remember to check in with the clinical sites and the patient journey to see exactly where those pain points are, and to take what we have learned from the first few products that are out there now commercially available, and to grow from that, to be better and to make this a smoother transition for patients and for clinical sites. So I think in that space is where a lot of this training sits from a clinical development standpoint, and partially commercially, from a manufacturing standpoint as well.
Yeah, the variability. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about the variability of, and controls in cell manufacturing, lot to lot. We don't spend enough time talking about the variability, like in the clinic, in the supply chain even. I mean, it's incredible. This is, I'll piss a lot of people off by saying this, but it's like, it almost makes a small molecule and monoclonal antibodies seem pretty darn easy to procure and produce, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's incredible.
I
go ahead.
That's something too that, it's just good to remember that. I mean, if you think about what we're doing, taking your own T cells again and bring them back to a patient, it's incredible. I think the supply chain, doesn't, not that they don't get enough attention, but you forget how impactful human error can be with this, especially with an autologous product, where you have to remanufacture if, say there's a backup bag if the original didn't get there for some reason. That's, this is not just hanging a bag of saline that you can just grab another one in the back from.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right.
We move so fast, and sometimes we forget to pause and look to see and to remind ourselves that is critical. And you can see this with companies now building out different groups that are now patient supply operations groups. So it's not supply chain necessarily, and it's not clinical development, but it's a patient supply group that is actually required to work very closely with our clinical sites. And this goes for several companies where you have even new roles emerging. It's not a clinical study lead, and it's not, a supply chain consultant. It's someone who sits cross-functionally, who can work directly with our clinical sites in a commercial and a clinical trial setting for cell therapy products, that can ask the sites and be that person that says, what is it that we need to do to get these patients that you're identifying treated, again, in a commercial or a clinical trial setting? And that just goes to show the value of how precious these products are to get to patients. You need someone to be able to help manage that. And that's where the expertise of these products comes in. Can you find people that can execute roles like this? It'll be some time before you can.
For sure. And I think it was our intent coming into this conversation to talk about, where we can offer some insight and benefit to biopharmas who are looking to, attract, retain talent for cell and gene manufacturing. I think as we talk here, Michael, I'm coming to the conclusion that this conversation is equally beneficial to anyone who's considering entering the space, right? Mm-hmm. Knowing these factors, all the variables, the fast pace, kind of before you come in eyes wide open. It's I think this is a super valuable conversation that we're going to have to push out to anyone who's considering, entering the field, whether they're coming from another place in life sciences or coming straight out of academia. You got to come into this eyes wide open, because it takes I think a special kind of person.
Yeah. And I think that goes to young emerging companies too. The culture that they develop, I can remember with Adaptimmune for sure, with such a small group. I mean, the company now has upwards of 500 employees. Mm-hmm. When there were 4 or 5 of us, the culture there, and maybe culture is not the right word, but all, the small core of us were so driven to get this to patients. And once you see how patients are responding and it's changing their lives, and they are now living quality lives that chemotherapy and other modalities to treat their cancer weren't available, that then takes over and you become almost obsessed with getting this safely to patients. But that culture that needs to, I think, be developed at a young company is really important, because the truth is we can all learn this. I may not be able to sit under a mic, and look under a microscope and figure things out the way a traditional scientist can, but we can all figure out a way to deliver these therapies to patients. But if you don't have and develop that culture as a company, it will be hard to retain people, and it will be hard to get them, especially now as large pharma starts to acquire a lot of companies and products. There's comfort at these bigger companies. And if someone said to me, do you want to go back to a young biotech? It's risky for sure, but
yeah.
I love the risk, and I would be thrilled. But there's differences. A lot of people, it's scary to them to go to a young biotech that is not as safe as a bigger, larger pharma company. So having that culture and that's important to start for a young company.
The Business of Biotech is brought to you in partnership with Cytiva. Together, we're committed to helping the leaders of new and emerging biopharma companies navigate the financial, organizational, human resources, and regulatory waters you'll encounter on your way from discovery to the clinic and beyond. Check out a host of useful resources for biotech leaders at Cytiva's Emerging Biotech Accelerator at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA lifesciences.com/emerging biotech.
That's a good segue. Good pivot point into, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is after talking with Erin about, your role on her advisory board and your background, the fact that you've got that perspective from Adaptimmune and this perspective from GSK. So you were just talking about the safety of big pharma. What other advantages does perhaps big pharma have in terms of its ability to recruit and retain top skill in the space?
Yeah, there are certainly advantages to big pharma, right? There are more resources at a large pharma than there are with a smaller company. There's an ability to work to collaborate. GSK might be able to collaborate with smaller companies, several of them, where you sort of get, a wider breadth of experience working with these younger companies. And the younger companies, these smaller biotechs, need that collaboration as well, right? They don't have the resources. So certainly a benefit being able to have more exposure at a large company where you can collaborate with these younger companies. Clinical sites certainly like working with larger companies. Again, there's more resources. They have more experience with them. The cons, younger companies might be able to move faster than larger companies. So, a small emerging biotech might be able to execute clinical trials much quicker. They can pivot much faster. And having smaller core teams where you have, KOLs involved, sometimes it's more efficient to have smaller than bigger. When it specifically about retaining talent, again, if you have a company that's developing culture and a really exciting product, that is really exciting to some people. But again, the safety of a bigger company sometimes is more attractive. So there's certainly pros and cons to each. I think if I were a young company coming up, how would I, attract talent and retain them versus a larger company? I think you'll have to spend a bit more time finding the right people for this and finding people that are going to go above and beyond and that can wear several different hats, so to speak. And that comes back to sort of where we started this conversation, having that foundational drive, passion, curiosity, and innovative mindset to really commit to this and want to do it, which is why the talent search for this is so challenging. To get someone from global pharma to small biotech, we certainly see it. And it's the people that say, I want, that looks really exciting. And I don't know if it's going to, in a couple of years, I don't know where I'll be, but I'm going for it. So that, the risk taker is certainly needed in these people as well.
Yeah, sure. There are risk takers and there's that altruistic hunger for, that new and emerging thing that perhaps a small and emerging biotech offers that people want to get involved in. But especially so, about a year and a half ago, I would say, I attended an event that LSPA, which is the Life Sciences PA group, put on at Villanova, and they had local area companies. The topic at hand was supply chain, but this sidebar conversation came out of it from the panelists, all from the Philadelphia region, talking about talent, but how local area companies that happen to be Philadelphia essentially steal from each other. They go from, one company to the next. Steal is a bit of a, big word, but the people on stage were joking about how I used to work at your company, you used to work at mine. They knew each other. And the whole thing was how these companies sort of, they move from company to company, even within their own region. And so my question for you is, it's not uncommon, right? This competitive nature, especially in cell and gene therapy and how important it is. How are these companies, especially, new and emerging biotechs or the smaller companies, recruiting but retaining these employees so that they're not moving around? And what does big pharma do to do that, to retain their employees that new and emerging biotechs can learn from?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Well, I think the first thing is, with hundreds of companies popping up, we have more options now. So, there are more options for me to go to young companies in this cell and gene therapy space, not only here in Philadelphia, but of course in Boston and San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have more options. What attracts people to younger companies still to this day, I don't know that I would say that I knew much about the clinical pipeline of Adaptimmune when I joined them. It was more, wow, this seems really exciting. But I think now you can compare the product. So you have to have that really strong clinical pipeline, or at least scientific backbone for people to join these companies, right? Because there's hundreds of them now. So you can sort of, you can tease them out a little bit. Like, you say, the financing for this company is really small versus this one, which is already 150 million in the first round. So those are things now that we have more experience and folks can look at and say, I don't know if I like. The other really critical piece that I certainly, when you look at who the folks are that are supporting these companies, not necessarily who's on the board, but who is it that's involved in these younger companies that are, advising them. And when you see those folks, right, it's a small space, Carl June sits on certain company, you certainly are, your ears perk up and your eyes light up and you think, oh, wow, I'd like to research that a bit more. So these kind of basic principles still apply with who's involved in the company, how much money does it seem like they're raising, how fast are they moving, that will get us into companies. When it comes to retaining it, it comes back again to the culture and also the collaboration you're having with clinical sites, with other, with investigators at the sites, and really to see the data that's coming out from those. I mean, the kind of, traditional principles still apply in this, and that if your data is not looking fantastic, sometimes it's hard to stay committed to a product when that it doesn't look great at the start or even through, some initial kind of rounds of clinical studies, especially with so many other companies. So I think, again, retaining at large or a small company still comes back to your pipeline and how strong your science is with these companies. And that's, because at the end, that's what's going to help these patients. I can say for sure, once you see patients responding, and especially in this small space, seeing and hearing the stories that are happening with these patients, I mean, it truly changes your life, where you then think, wow, I can't believe that this is what we get, this is how we're making a living, with helping patients and developing and changing the way that cancer is treated. And that is, that's what keeps people at companies.
Drives you, yeah.
It really does. Sounds cliche and sort of, everyone's slogan with the company, but it truly, it makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. From an ongoing perspective, though, what would you say are that biotech decision makers, in terms of what they should be instilling in their teams going forward? What are the top trends, topics? Because cell and gene therapy it's on a trajectory to, it's going and going and going.
Mm-hmm.
Today and in the near term, what would you say that biotech decision makers need to be ensuring that their teams are learning, or, just in terms of trends and topics, what are the must-have topics?
Do you mean for the companies, these trends and trainings that are must-haves?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think we touched a bit on this, but I think, again, understanding what is working and what is not working at the clinic site level for the patients and for the folks that are administering these types of therapy, whether it's commercial or clinical, taking that information, bringing it back, and then implementing your training. So again, I think it comes back to supply chain, the new developed groups in patient supply, understanding exactly what's occurring in a vein-to-vein setting, manufacturing, And, within each of these groups, the training, again, the information is going to come from from the learnings that we get from these sites and from the folks that are actually involved in administering the therapies.
Yeah. Michael, I'm curious about your thoughts. I mean, obviously we can't anticipate. I think it would be unfair to anticipate that academia would be able to keep pace with the needs of the industry you serve. Okay, so let's just put that aside for a minute and assume that you can't expect an annual batch of new graduates that are like up to speed on what's going on in your clinic right now today. On the manufacturing side in biopharma, we see a lot of kind of middle. I don't know if I'd call them kind of middleman institutions, but institutions, resources such as the Biomanufacturing Training and Education Center or the National Institute for Bioprocess Research and Training, trying to fill a gap there, like trying to help bridge that gap between academia and the space, the industry space. Is there are there resources like that available to companies like yours right now? If not, should there be? Is there sort of a place where that you look to or rely on to kind of help bridge that gap and bring up that skill set?
Yeah, I can't speak to the those types of offerings at GSK, but I know for sure we have people who have joined our company who come fresh from graduate programs in biotechnology that are specific to either manufacturing, or there's actually even general biotech programs out there. So I know actually we have some folks in Canada that have completed these programs, and they are some of the most brilliant and invested young people that we have seen. The talent is incredible. And again, this comes back to people who, after college thought the research was really cool. They maybe, went for biology in college and didn't at that point know what to do next, but they were really drawn to this research because the few folks that I know that have gone this route, I'd ask them, like, how did that occur? How did you get here? Because you have this same drive and passion. And sure enough, they were graduate programs in biotechnology where they were able to take that additional step after college and to get more experience and then enter into, they could have gone either to small biotech or to a global pharma, but that talent coming out, I wish I had the opportunity when I was in graduate school to go this route. Really incredible talent with folks that are able to tack on after college the additional 2 to 3 year programs that are available. I don't know enough about the programs and where they are available, but I can tell you for sure that is a massive, you can clearly see the difference when people come to join companies with these degrees, and
wow,
they have that foundation again where they are just so enthralled with this research, and it's really something else.
Well, that's great. I mean, the fact that those programs exist is more than I knew, and I'm happy to hear it. Yeah.
And I know, there was an article recently in the UK where they're going for, specifically for manufacturing, I think, there are plans of reducing maybe the education needed to get involved in some of these roles, right? Where previously maybe it was a master's or PhD that was required for just to even get your foot in for some of the manufacturing roles. And I think they're now looking at this and saying, maybe that's not the best way with as many jobs that are going to be opening globally in this space. Finding the talent is certainly challenging. Maybe we need to reassess what type of talent we're looking for. And this master's program that, exists in some parts of the world in biotech is certainly a step in the right direction for that.
Yeah. I read some research recently that talked about the fact that, or the potential that the UK might be in position to overtake the U.S.'s leadership in clinical development around cell and therapy. So it's no surprise to me that those laggards, those lazy folks across the pond would want to lower the bar just so that they could, further accelerate their
That's right. Yeah.
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Dr. Gaspar, I'm kidding. That's just a joke.
I love it. I mean, it makes so much sense, especially, it just makes a lot of sense. And again, I think it's funny. We could identify these people. There were in Canada. At the time we hadn't met a ton of people. We had the company, GSK. We had sort of just gotten into the space, and you could tell there were bright stars in the room that were asking these questions that were young. And I remember asking one of my colleagues, like, "Who is that? And how does she know so much information about this? This is crazy." And sure enough, after getting to speak with her, she had mentioned this program up in Canada. And same thing, right? How did you get into it? And she said, I just thought it was really cool. I heard about this immunotherapy and now this cell therapy, and I wasn't sure, what was I going to do with a biology degree? And sure enough, has become one of our most, prized people. So it's so exciting to see that, and hoping that gap can bridge some of the discussions we've had today, whether it's in manufacturing or just how do you find talent. I think we'll slowly start to produce more with programs like this. And I think Penn has some now, of course, but it's a little bit slower to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, to wrap things up, Michael, we're running short on time here, but I want to give, I'm going to just throw like one final kind of big open-ended question out there that'll challenge you to give me a concise answer. You've got a lot of experience in the space, across the breadth from small to large pharma. You're the kind of guy that I think would be fun to work with. Like you've got that certain it factor, right? Which speaks to culture. I think, we started out talking about the culture at Adaptimmune and how that was so fundamental to the company's growth. So the question is, kind of thinking putting all of this into perspective, knowledge, culture, that it factor, what crystallize like one final piece of advice for the leaders of emerging biopharmas on creating an environment and maintaining an environment where that innovative talent, that inquisitive, curious, super smart talent wants to stay.
Yeah. So I think first off, you have to have people around you. You have to build a team of people around you that share that drive and that passion. And there is no question my success certainly is not mine. It comes from working around other people that feel that passion, that truly get excited about this. One of my mentors, would always say to me if I were feeling stressed or just fed up with this sometimes, would say, Michael, look at what we're doing. Look at how cool this research is. We're getting, we get to wake up and help people every day do this incredible research. And until you find something cooler and more valuable to do and more rewarding for patients, and we all know people too, right? Everyone knows someone who has been faced with cancer. So having the right people around you that share that, because when you don't have the energy to keep going in small biotech or even these bigger companies, you have to have the right people around you. So I think you have to really start with that core group that can share the passion and drive to deliver products like this. And that really, will get you through the tough times at these young companies for sure.
Yeah. Sound advice.
Yeah.
Michael, it's been fun. It's been a pleasure. It's also been an honor speaking with you. I appreciate the time you gave us.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was fun.
Yeah. Erin, thank you for facilitating the introduction and bringing Michael onto the show.
That was my pleasure. I'm happy to finally meet him, like I said, via Zoom.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we didn't scare him away from his service to your editorial board. So that's Erin Harris and Michael Mehler. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online in partnership with Cytiva, which offers a host of great resources for new and emerging biotechs at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. Erin and I offer a host of great resources for emerging biopharmas as well. You can find us at cellandgene.com and bioprocessonline.com, respectively, where we invite you to subscribe to our newsletters. I hope you enjoyed today's show, and if you did, hit subscribe, give us a review. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, thanks for listening.